Picture this. Jesus appears in the temple at 12, astounding scholars with his wisdom, then complete silence. 20 years vanish from history until he emerges at 30 with teachings that would reshape civilization. This isn't some theological mystery. It's documented historical fact that even orthodox biblical scholars acknowledge. The Gospels, which meticulously trace his lineage back 14 generations, suddenly go mute about 2 decades of his life. Compare this to other spiritual leaders. Buddha spent 6 years in rigorous seeking before his enlightenment. Moses wandered 40 years in wilderness preparation. Muhammad contemplated for years in desert caves. Yet we're supposed to believe Jesus, the most influential teacher in human history, simply worked as a carpenter and spontaneously developed revolutionary wisdom. Ancient texts whisper of journeys to Egypt's mystery schools, India's ashrams, Tibet's monasteries, and the secretive Essen communities. For centuries, religious authorities have maintained careful silence about these possibilities. They understood something crucial. Where Jesus went during those missing years fundamentally changes everything we think we know about Christianity itself. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight. The silence in the Gospels about Jesus' missing years isn't an accident of history. It's the result of a calculated campaign to erase inconvenient truths that would have undermined the political foundations of institutional Christianity. When we look at the early Christian communities of the 1st and 2nd centuries, we find a radically different landscape than what most people imagine. These communities possessed dozens of Gospels, teaching texts, and biographical accounts of Jesus that painted a far more complex picture of his life and teachings. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in Egypt in 1945, contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus that emphasize direct spiritual experience over institutional authority. The Gospel of Philip discusses esoteric knowledge and mystical practices. The infancy Gospel of Thomas describes young Jesus performing miracles and displaying wisdom that clearly came from systematic training, not spontaneous divine inspiration. These weren't fringe documents written by heretical sects. They were mainstream Christian texts used by communities across the Mediterranean world. Early Christian leader Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, openly referenced multiple Gospels and encouraged his followers to seek wisdom from various sources. Origen, one of the most influential early theologians, studied under Jewish rabbis, Greek philosophers, and Eastern mystics, following what he believed was Jesus' own example of learning from multiple traditions. So what happened to this rich tapestry of early Christian literature? The answer lies in the political transformation of Christianity from a diverse spiritual movement into a tool of imperial control. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD and later convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the goal wasn't theological purity, it was political unity. Constantine needed a religion that could bind together his vast, diverse empire under a single authority structure. A Jesus who had studied with Buddhist monks in India, learned meditation techniques from Hindu masters, and absorbed wisdom from Egyptian mystery schools presented a fundamental problem. It suggested that divine truth could be found outside the Christian church. The bishops at Nicaea faced a crucial decision. They could preserve the historical Jesus, a brilliant spiritual seeker who had achieved enlightenment through years of dedicated study and practice, or they could create a mythological Christ whose divine nature was unique, unrepeatable. They chose the latter, and in doing so, they had to systematically suppress any evidence of Jesus' actual educational journey. Consider the political implications of the alternative. If Jesus had learned his abilities through study and practice, then others could follow the same path. This would make the institutional church unnecessary as an intermediary between humans and the divine. People could pursue their own spiritual development through multiple wisdom traditions, just as Jesus had done. The exclusive authority of Christian bishops would crumble overnight. The suppression campaign was remarkably thorough. Imperial edicts ordered the destruction of heretical texts. Libraries were burned. Scholars who possessed alternative gospels were persecuted. The famous Library of Alexandria, which likely contained extensive records of Jesus' travels and studies, was systematically dismantled over several centuries. By the time the official Christian canon was finalized in the late 4th century, nearly all traces of Jesus' educational journey had been eliminated from official records. But the cover-up goes deeper than simple book burning. The early church fathers had to actively rewrite the narrative of Jesus' development. Instead of acknowledging the missing years as a period of intensive study, they created the doctrine of Jesus' inherent divine nature from birth. This theological innovation served a dual purpose. It explained Jesus' extraordinary abilities without requiring any educational background, and it made those abilities permanently inaccessible to ordinary humans. The infancy gospel of Thomas provides fascinating glimpses of what was suppressed. It describes young Jesus demonstrating advanced knowledge of sacred geometry, performing healings that follow specific techniques, and engaging in philosophical debates that reveal systematic training in multiple wisdom traditions. These aren't random miracles, they're the applications of learned skills. But acknowledging this would have destroyed the foundation of institutional Christianity's exclusive authority. The same patterns of information suppression continue today. Historical documents that reveal Jesus' true educational journey remain locked away in private collections or dismissed by mainstream academia as too controversial for public discussion. That's why we created the Insights Academy newsletter, to share the suppressed knowledge that institutions don't want widely available. Subscribers get access to rare historical documents, including a free copy of the Kabbalion, which contains principles that Jesus likely studied during his missing years. But this offer is limited because some truths are too powerful to share indefinitely. The parallels between ancient and modern information control are striking. Just as the Council of Nicaea eliminated inconvenient gospels, today's gatekeepers determine which historical evidence receives academic attention and which gets relegated to the margins. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945 should have revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity, but most of its revelations remain confined to specialist circles, while the general public continues to accept the sanitized version created for political purposes in the 4th century. What makes this suppression particularly tragic is that Jesus' actual story, a brilliant seeker who dedicated decades to learning from the world's greatest wisdom traditions, is far more inspiring than the mythological version created by imperial politics. The real Jesus demonstrates that extraordinary spiritual development is possible for anyone willing to commit to serious study and practice. The mythological Christ suggests that such abilities are forever beyond human reach. The evidence of systematic suppression extends beyond missing texts to the structure of the New Testament itself. Notice how the Gospels jump from Jesus' childhood directly to his ministry, with only the briefest mention of his growing in wisdom and stature. This isn't narrative efficiency, it's deliberate omission. Gospel writers knew about Jesus' travels and education, but they were writing for communities already under pressure to conform to imperial expectations. Even within the canonical texts, careful readers can find hints of what was removed. Jesus' profound knowledge of diverse spiritual traditions, his familiarity with meditation techniques, his understanding of energy healing, and his ability to engage with people from radically different cultural backgrounds all point to extensive cross-cultural education. These weren't skills he could have acquired in the small village of Nazareth. The transformation of Jesus from historical seeker to mythological figure represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. It served the immediate political needs of the Roman Empire, but it robbed humanity of a far more valuable legacy, proof that any dedicated individual can achieve extraordinary spiritual development through sincere seeking and systematic study. Despite centuries of suppression, traces of Jesus' true journey survive in the most unexpected places. Tibetan monasteries preserve oral traditions about the student they called Issa. Indian ashrams maintain records of the Western seeker who mastered their meditation techniques. Egyptian temples contain inscriptions that may reference Jesus' initiation into their mystery schools. The silence in the Bible about Jesus' missing years isn't a gap in the historical record. It's a scar left by one of history's most systematic cover-ups. Understanding this suppression is the key to recovering the truth about where Jesus really went and what he actually learned during those transformative decades. Picture this: a young Jewish man in his 20s, raised on stories of Moses receiving divine wisdom in Egypt, standing at the crossroads of 3 continents where the greatest minds of the ancient world gathered to unlock the mysteries of existence. This wasn't just any destination, this was Alexandria, the intellectual crown jewel of the Mediterranean, where the largest library in human history held over 400 scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of civilizations. When we talk about Jesus potentially spending time in Egypt, we're not spinning wild theories. We're following a well-worn path that countless seekers had traveled for over 1,000 years before his birth. Egypt wasn't just a neighboring country, it was the Harvard, Oxford, and MIT of the ancient world all rolled into one, specifically for those seeking to understand the deeper mysteries of life and consciousness. The historical context here is crucial. Alexandria housed the largest Jewish community outside of Palestine, with over 900,000 residents who had been there for centuries. These weren't isolated immigrants. They were deeply integrated into Egyptian intellectual life while maintaining their Jewish identity. The most famous example? Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Jesus who masterfully wove together Hebrew theology, Greek philosophy, and Egyptian mystical practices into a sophisticated spiritual system. Philo's work gives us a window into exactly the kind of intellectual environment Jesus would have encountered. Here was a Jewish scholar writing about the Logos, the divine word that creates reality, decades before John's Gospel would use identical language to describe Jesus himself. Philo discussed the soul's journey toward union with the divine, the symbolic interpretation of Scripture, and the idea that true knowledge comes through direct spiritual experience rather than mere intellectual study. But let's dig deeper into what made Egypt so magnetically attractive to spiritual seekers. The Hermetic tradition, named after Hermes Trismegistus, had been developing sophisticated concepts about consciousness and reality for millennia. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated philosophical and practical systems for understanding how consciousness interacts with the physical world. Consider the core Hermetic principle, as above, so below, the idea that patterns in the heavens reflect patterns on Earth, and that the microcosm of human consciousness mirrors the macrocosm of universal consciousness. Now listen to Jesus' later teaching, the kingdom of heaven is within you. The conceptual DNA is unmistakable. Jesus consistently taught that external religious observance meant nothing without internal transformation, a perspective that was absolutely central to Egyptian mystery school training. The parallels become even more striking when we examine specific practices. Egyptian papyri from this period describe healing techniques involving the laying on of hands, the use of saliva mixed with earth to treat blindness, and rituals for transforming one substance into another. These aren't vague similarities, they're precise methodological matches to Jesus' recorded miracles. What's particularly fascinating is that early church fathers didn't deny Jesus' connection to Egyptian wisdom traditions. They acknowledged it openly. Origen, one of Christianity's greatest early theologians, wrote about Jesus studying with Egyptian priests. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, referenced Jesus' familiarity with Egyptian sacred arts. These weren't fringe voices. These were mainstream Christian scholars, working with sources and oral traditions we no longer have access to. The initiation practices of Egyptian mystery schools provide another compelling connection. Candidates underwent symbolic death and resurrection ceremonies, ritual purifications in sacred pools, and training designed to awaken what Egyptians called the Eye of Horus, inner spiritual sight. They learned to see beyond the veil of ordinary perception into deeper spiritual realities. Sound familiar? Jesus' entire ministry centered on themes of death and resurrection, baptism as spiritual rebirth, and helping people develop spiritual vision to see the kingdom of heaven that was already present but hidden from ordinary sight. Even the Gospel of Matthew provides a historical foundation for this connection. The flight to Egypt narrative isn't just a brief refugee story. It establishes that Jesus' family had Egyptian connections and knowledge of the country. In ancient times, such connections often lasted generations, creating networks that could support later study and travel. Consider Jesus' dramatic confrontation with the money changers in the temple. This wasn't random anger. It reflected deep knowledge of sacred space principles that were fundamental to Egyptian temple practice. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian temples had maintained strict separation between commercial activity and sacred space. The mixing of money and worship was seen as a profound violation of cosmic order, or Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of divine truth and justice that permeates Jesus' teachings about righteousness. Archaeological evidence supports the reality of Jewish-Egyptian religious synthesis during this period. Excavations have uncovered Jewish communities throughout Egypt that blended traditional Hebrew practices with Egyptian mystical elements. Papyri document Jewish mystics participating in Egyptian mystery school initiations. This wasn't cultural contamination, it was sophisticated theological dialogue between traditions. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at deserves special attention because it provides such a clear bridge to Jesus' later ministry. Ma'at represented cosmic order, truth, and justice, principles that must be embodied in human society to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of heaven consistently emphasized these same themes: truth-telling, justice for the oppressed, and the alignment of human society with divine principles. What emerges from this evidence isn't speculation. It's a coherent picture of a young Jewish mystic following an established path of spiritual education that had been available for centuries. Egypt offered something Palestine couldn't: systematic training in the practical aspects of spiritual consciousness, taught by priesthoods that had been refining these techniques for millennia. The question isn't whether Jesus could have studied in Egypt. It's how a serious spiritual seeker of his time could have avoided it. The intellectual and spiritual resources were unmatched. The Jewish community was established and welcoming, and the synthesis of traditions was already well developed. This foundation in Egyptian wisdom traditions would prove crucial for what came next in Jesus' journey, because Egypt was just the beginning of a much larger educational odyssey that would take him to the roof of the world itself. The Roman Empire's appetite for luxury goods created something remarkable: a network of trade routes that connected the Mediterranean directly to India's spice markets, silk merchants, and philosophical centers. Every summer, as monsoon winds filled their sails, Roman ships departed Alexandria carrying gold and silver, returning months later, heavy with pepper, cinnamon, and precious stones. The port of Muciris on India's Malabar coast became so crucial to this trade that Roman coins have been found there in abundance, dating precisely to Jesus' era. This wasn't some impossible journey requiring divine intervention. Wealthy Romans routinely made this voyage for business. Merchants, diplomats, and scholars traveled these routes regularly. If a young Jewish man possessed determination and perhaps modest financial backing, the passage to India was entirely achievable. The question isn't whether Jesus could have reached India, it's whether the evidence suggests he actually did. In 1887, a Russian journalist named Nicholas Notovich claimed to have discovered something extraordinary at the Hemis monastery in Ladakh. According to Notovich, ancient Tibetan manuscripts described a young man named Issa who arrived from the west around the 1st century. These texts, allegedly translated from Pali scrolls, told of Issa studying Hindu scriptures, debating with Brahmin priests, and ultimately advocating for the spiritual equality of all people regardless of caste. Now, Notovich's claims have been heavily disputed. Several scholars who later visited Hemis found no trace of these documents. But here's what's fascinating: whether or not those specific manuscripts existed, the story they told aligns remarkably with both the historical possibilities and the philosophical parallels we can observe in Jesus' later teachings. Consider Jesus' most famous principle: as you sow, so shall you reap. This isn't just agricultural wisdom, it's a precise expression of karma, the Sanskrit concept that actions create consequences across lifetimes. When Jesus spoke of seeds falling on different types of soil, producing different harvests based on conditions, he was using the exact metaphorical framework that appears throughout Indian spiritual literature. The Bhagavad Gita, composed centuries before Jesus, uses identical agricultural imagery to explain spiritual development. The parallels run deeper than metaphors. Jesus consistently emphasized compassion over ritual, inner transformation over external observance. He rejected social hierarchies based on birth or religious status, a revolutionary position that directly mirrors Buddhist and Hindu reform movements of his era. When Jesus declared that the kingdom of heaven belonged to the poor in spirit rather than the religiously privileged, he was echoing arguments that Buddhist monks had been making against the Brahmin caste system for centuries. Look at Jesus' healing methods. He frequently used touch and what we might call energy work. He would place his hands on the sick, breathe on them, or have them touch his clothing. These techniques align remarkably with Ayurvedic healing traditions and yogic practices that were already ancient in Jesus' time. The idea that spiritual development could manifest as physical healing was central to Indian medicine, not common in Jewish tradition. Jesus' relationship with meditation becomes particularly intriguing when viewed through this lens. The Gospels mention him regularly withdrawing to pray alone, sometimes for entire nights, culminating in his 40 days in the wilderness. This wasn't typical Jewish prayer, which was communal and structured. This was extended solitary contemplation, exactly the practice that formed the foundation of both Hindu and Buddhist spiritual development. In Kashmir, local traditions maintain that a holy man named Asaf lived among them, teaching and healing. They point to specific locations: a meadow where he supposedly preached, a spring where he performed healings. The name Asaf translates roughly as leader of the healed or son of Joseph. While these oral traditions emerged centuries later and can't be verified historically, they represent a persistent cultural memory of a Western spiritual teacher whose description matches the gospel accounts of Jesus. But perhaps the most compelling evidence lies not in disputed manuscripts or local legends, but in the theological implications of what we observe. Jesus' teachings represent a remarkable synthesis: Jewish monotheism combined with Eastern concepts of karma, meditation, and universal compassion. This synthesis makes perfect sense if Jesus spent his missing years studying with Indian masters, learning to bridge different spiritual traditions. The early Christian emphasis on renunciation of worldly attachments, the development of monastic communities, the focus on inner purification. These elements appear more naturally in Eastern traditions than in first-century Judaism. When Jesus spoke of losing one's life to find it, of becoming like little children to enter the kingdom, of the last becoming first, he was expressing the fundamental Eastern insight that ego dissolution leads to spiritual realization. What's particularly striking is how Jesus' parables consistently focus on gradual growth and transformation, rather than sudden divine intervention. Seeds slowly germinating, yeast gradually leavening dough, small beginnings yielding great harvests. This understanding of spiritual development as a natural, organic process aligns perfectly with yogic and Buddhist psychology, where enlightenment typically unfolds through sustained practice rather than divine grace alone. The geographical evidence supports this possibility too. The ancient Silk Road passed directly through regions where these Kashmiri traditions locate Jesus' presence. Travelers moving between the Mediterranean and India would naturally follow routes through Kashmir, making it a logical stopping point for someone journeying between worlds. If Jesus did spend years in India, it would explain not just the philosophical parallels but also his remarkable confidence when he began teaching. He didn't present himself as someone discovering new truths, but as someone who had already integrated profound spiritual insights and was now adapting them for a Jewish audience. His authority came not from divine revelation alone, but from years of serious study with established masters. This raises profound questions about the nature of Jesus' mission. Rather than bringing entirely unique divine knowledge, he may have been synthesizing humanity's highest spiritual insights, creating a bridge between Eastern wisdom and Western monotheism. If this perspective intrigues you, examine Jesus' teachings alongside Buddhist and Hindu texts. The parallels will surprise you. But India may have been only one destination in a much longer journey of preparation. The trade routes that carried Jesus eastward also connected to other centers of ancient wisdom, other traditions that may have shaped the teacher who would eventually transform the world. High in the rarefied air of the Himalayas, where prayer flags flutter against snow-capped peaks and ancient monasteries cling to impossible cliffsides, lies perhaps the most intriguing chapter of Jesus' missing years. Tibet, that mystical repository of spiritual wisdom, holds oral traditions and written records that speak of a young prophet from the West who came seeking the deepest truths about existence itself. You have to understand something about Tibetan culture that makes their testimony particularly compelling. For over 2 millennia, Tibetan monks have maintained oral traditions with an accuracy that would make modern historians weep with envy. These aren't casual stories passed down around campfires, they're carefully preserved teachings, memorized word for word and transmitted through rigorous monastic training. When Tibetan lamas speak of historical events, they're drawing from a living library that has survived invasions, political upheavals, and the passage of countless generations. The most famous of these records is the Pali manuscript allegedly housed in the Hemis monastery in Ladakh. According to this text, a young man named Issa the Tibetan rendering of Jesus arrived from the West around the age of 14, having already spent time among the wisdom keepers of India. The manuscript describes how this earnest seeker impressed the Buddhist masters with his spiritual hunger and his remarkable ability to grasp complex philosophical concepts that typically took students years to understand. Now, I know what you're thinking. Where are these manuscripts today? Why can't we examine them directly? The truth is, several Western researchers claim to have seen these documents in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including the Russian journalist Nicholas Notovich and the Tibetan scholar Lama Katsi Dava Zamdub. But when later investigators arrived at Hemis, the manuscripts seemed to vanish like morning mist. This has led skeptics to dismiss the entire account as wishful thinking or outright fabrication. But here's where it gets interesting. Even if we can't verify these specific documents, the oral traditions persist across multiple monasteries and regions. Independent Tibetan sources, separated by hundreds of miles and different lineages, tell remarkably consistent stories about this Western student who came to learn the Dharma. In academic circles, we call this multiple attestation. When separate sources corroborate the same basic narrative, it suggests an underlying historical kernel. Consider the practical realities that would have made such a journey not just possible but logical. The trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to Tibet were well established by the 1st century. Caravans regularly moved through Kashmir, carrying silk, spices, and precious stones, but also ideas, philosophies, and spiritual zikas. A young man with connections to merchant families, remember? Joseph's carpentry business would have put Jesus in contact with traders, could have traveled these routes with relative ease. More compelling than the logistics, though, are the profound philosophical parallels between Jesus's later teachings and core Tibetan Buddhist concepts. Take the idea of universal compassion, or karuna in Sanskrit. Tibetan Buddhism teaches that true enlightenment means developing boundless compassion for all sentient beings, regardless of their station, behavior, or worthiness. Sound familiar? This is precisely what Jesus would later demonstrate when he taught his followers to love their enemies and show mercy to the undeserving. The Sermon on the Mount reads like a masterclass in the Bodhisattva ideal, the Buddhist concept of an enlightened being who postpones their own final liberation to help others achieve freedom from suffering. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the pointy earth. These aren't just beautiful sentiments. They're sophisticated teachings about transcending ego-driven desires and finding joy in service to others. Even more striking is how Jesus' understanding of spiritual practice seems to reflect the Buddhist middle way. Unlike the extreme ascetics of his time who punished their bodies to achieve enlightenment, Jesus advocated for a balanced approach. He fasted, but he also feasted. He withdrew for solitary prayer, but he engaged actively with the world. This nuanced understanding of spiritual discipline is characteristic of someone who has been trained in Tibetan methods, which emphasize finding the perfect balance between effort and ease. The Tibetan concept of the tulku system, where enlightened masters consciously choose to reincarnate to continue teaching, may have profoundly influenced early Christian ideas about Jesus' divine nature. Imagine young Jesus learning that consciousness itself is deathless, that awakened beings can voluntarily return to help others, and that the ultimate reality transcends individual identity. These concepts would have given him a framework for understanding his own mission that goes far beyond the tribal deity worship he would have encountered in Palestine. Look at the specific practices that appear in both traditions. Tibetan Buddhism emphasizes meditation techniques for calming the mind and developing insight practices that would explain Jesus' ability to maintain perfect equanimity even under torture. The Tibetan understanding of energy healing through manipulation of subtle forces mirrors the effortless way Jesus seemed to cure illnesses with a touch or a word. The guru-disciple relationship, though central to Tibetan spiritual transmission, appears throughout Jesus' interactions with his apostles. Perhaps most significantly, Tibetan teachings about the nature of mind and ultimate reality align perfectly with Jesus' more mystical statements. When he spoke of the kingdom of heaven being within, when he declared, "I and the Father are one," when he said, "Before Abraham was I am," these aren't the words of someone making it up as he goes along. They're the precise expressions of someone who has been systematically trained in the deepest insights about consciousness and reality. This training would have prepared Jesus for his final trials in ways that purely divine intervention cannot explain. Tibetan practitioners spend years learning to remain centered in the face of extreme physical and mental challenges. They develop what's called unshakable presence, the ability to maintain compassionate awareness even when everything around them is falling apart. When you watch Jesus' behavior during his arrest, trial, and crucifixion, you're seeing these practices in action. The implications are staggering. If Jesus spent years in Tibet learning from enlightened masters, it suggests his extraordinary consciousness was developed through systematic training, not spontaneous divine download. It means his teachings represent a synthesis of the world's wisdom traditions, carefully adapted for a Middle Eastern audience. It explains why his message resonated so powerfully across cultures, and why it continues to transform lives 2,000 years later. The question isn't whether this changes Jesus' significance, it amplifies it. Here was someone so committed to understanding ultimate truth that he traveled thousands of miles, learned from multiple traditions, and then returned to share that wisdom with a world desperately in need of healing. That's not diminishing the divine. That's showing us what divinity looks like when it takes human form and does the work. While theories about Jesus traveling to distant lands capture our imagination, there's actually a far more compelling explanation for those missing years that's been hiding in plain sight, right in his own backyard. The answer lies with one of history's most fascinating and mysterious religious communities, the Essenes. You've probably never heard of them, despite the fact that they were one of the most influential Jewish sects of Jesus' time. That's because they operated largely in secret, maintaining hidden communities and guarding their teachings from outsiders. But thanks to one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, we now know exactly who they were and what they believed, and the parallels to Jesus' later ministry are absolutely stunning. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy chasing a lost goat near the Dead Sea stumbled upon clay jars hidden in caves. Inside were scrolls that had been preserved for nearly 2,000 years, the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. These weren't just random religious texts, they were the library of an Essen community at Qumran, giving us an unprecedented window into their world. But the Essenes weren't just known from these scrolls. Ancient historians like Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder all wrote about them, describing a community unlike anything else in Judaism. Josephus, who actually lived among them for a time, estimated their numbers at around 4,000, spread across various settlements throughout Judea. What made the Essenes so different? Everything about their lifestyle and beliefs seems to prefigure what we see in Jesus' ministry and early Christianity. Let's start with baptism. While mainstream Judaism practiced ritual washing, the Essenes elevated this to something revolutionary. They believed in complete immersion as a symbol of spiritual rebirth and purification from sin. Sound familiar? This wasn't just a one-time event, either. They practiced daily ritual baths, believing that inner transformation required constant purification. Now think about John the Baptist, appearing seemingly out of nowhere in the wilderness, preaching baptism for the forgiveness of sins. Where did this radical departure from traditional Judaism come from? The Essenes had been practicing this exact form of baptism for generations. Many scholars believe John was either an Essene himself or heavily influenced by their teachings. And if John was connected to the Essenes, it's almost certain that Jesus encountered their ideas through him. But the baptism connection is just the beginning. The Essenes lived in intentional communities where they shared everything in common. Private property was essentially abolished. When you joined their community, you surrendered all your possessions to the group. They ate together, worked together, and supported each other completely. Does this remind you of anything? The Book of Acts describes the early Christian community in Jerusalem in almost identical terms. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. The Essenes also had a fascinating approach to healing that mirrors Jesus' ministry. They were renowned throughout the region as healers, but their methods went far beyond conventional medicine. Yes, they used herbs and natural remedies, but they also practiced what they called laying on of hands for healing. They believed that spiritual purity and divine connection could channel healing power through touch and prayer. They studied what they called the names of angels, specific invocations and prayers they believed could invoke heavenly intervention for healing. This connects to another remarkable aspect of Essen belief, their detailed knowledge of angelic hierarchies and their conviction that they could communicate directly with celestial beings. Their scrolls contain elaborate descriptions of angelic orders and their functions. They believed that through proper purification and spiritual discipline, humans could join the angelic liturgy and participate in heavenly worship even while on earth. When you read Jesus' frequent references to angels throughout the Gospels, this background suddenly makes perfect sense. The Essenes were also intensely apocalyptic, believing they were living in the final days before God would establish his kingdom on earth. They expected a coming Messiah, or actually two Messiahs, one priestly and one royal, who would overthrow the corrupt religious establishment and restore true righteousness. Their community saw itself as preparing for this cosmic transformation through rigorous spiritual discipline and moral purity. Their daily routine was monastic in its intensity. They rose before dawn for prayer, worked in silence during the day, ate simple communal meals, and spent their evenings studying sacred texts and engaging in spiritual discussion. Celibacy was common, though not universal, and they followed strict dietary laws that went beyond traditional Jewish requirements. They refused to participate in animal sacrifice, believing that prayer and righteous living were the true offerings God desired. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Essenes had a 3-year initiation process for new members. The first year was a probationary period where candidates lived alongside the community but weren't fully integrated. The second and third years involved deeper instruction in their secret teachings and gradual admission to their sacred meals and ceremonies. Only after completing this entire process could someone become a full member of their brotherhood. 3 years. That's a significant portion of Jesus' missing time right there. The Essenes also followed a different calendar system than mainstream Judaism. While most Jews used a lunar calendar, the Essenes followed a solar calendar of exactly 364 days. This created ongoing conflicts about when to celebrate religious festivals and could explain some of the chronological discrepancies scholars have noted in the Gospel accounts. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls speak repeatedly of a figure called the Teacher of Righteousness, a mysterious leader who guided their community and revealed hidden truths about God's plan. Some of the language used to describe this teacher bears striking similarities to how the Gospels describe Jesus. Whether this was a specific historical figure who influenced Jesus, or whether Jesus himself might have been identified with this role, remains one of the most tantalizing questions in biblical scholarship. The Essenes believed in graduated revelation, the idea that spiritual truth should be shared according to the readiness of the listener. This explains their emphasis on secrecy and their practice of teaching in layers, with deeper mysteries reserved for the initiated. When you look at Jesus' use of parables, stories that could be understood on multiple levels, with hidden meanings accessible only to those with spiritual insight, you're seeing this same teaching methodology in action. The evidence doesn't prove definitively that Jesus spent his missing years with the Essenes, but the connections are too numerous and specific to ignore. Every major element of his later ministry has clear precedence in Essene practice and belief. The question isn't whether Jesus was influenced by the Essenes, it's how deeply that influence shaped his understanding of his own mission. This connection transforms our understanding of Jesus' teachings from revolutionary innovations to the culmination of a rich tradition of Jewish mysticism and spiritual practice that had been developing for generations in the practice. Wilderness communities of Judea. Looking at Jesus' teachings through the lens of his possible travels, something remarkable emerges. The wisdom he shared wasn't revolutionary because it was completely new. It was revolutionary because of how masterfully he wove together the deepest insights from humanity's greatest spiritual traditions into something that transcended all cultural boundaries. Think about this. Every major spiritual tradition that existed before Christianity contains remarkably similar core insights. The ancient Egyptians understood divine consciousness as something that could be awakened within human beings. Indian sages taught about the law of cause and effect governing our spiritual evolution. Persian mystics spoke of the eternal battle between light and darkness within the human soul. Jewish prophets demanded justice for the oppressed and care for the marginalized. These weren't coincidences. Either these traditions shared common origins or certain universal truths about human consciousness and divine connection naturally emerge when people look deeply enough into the nature of existence. Jesus appears to have recognized this universal wisdom and synthesized it into teachings that could speak to anyone, regardless of their cultural background. Consider the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This principle appears in virtually every major tradition that preceded Christianity. Confucius taught it in China 5 centuries earlier. Hindu texts express it. Buddhist teachings contain it. The Egyptian goddess Ma'at embodied it as the principle of cosmic justice. Yet Jesus didn't simply repeat this ancient wisdom. He He embedded it within Jewish religious language and imagery in a way that made universal truths accessible to his specific cultural context, while simultaneously transcending that context. His healing methods provide another fascinating example. The techniques Jesus used mirror practices found across multiple traditions. Egyptian temple healing involved laying on of hands, prayer, and the understanding that physical ailments often reflected spiritual imbalances. Indian Ayurvedic traditions taught that consciousness could directly influence bodily health. The Essenes, as we explored earlier, practiced therapeutic techniques that combine prayer, herbal knowledge, and energy work. Jesus' approach to healing suggests familiarity with all these methods, yet he adapted them in ways that emphasized faith and spiritual transformation over ritual technique. The agricultural metaphors in his parables reveal another layer of this synthesis. Stories about seeds, soil, harvests, and seasons appear throughout ancient wisdom literature because they speak to universal human experiences. But Jesus used these familiar images to convey insights about spiritual development that drew from multiple traditions simultaneously. When he spoke about seeds falling on different types of ground, he was teaching about receptivity to spiritual truth, a concept central to Egyptian mystery schools. His emphasis on inner transformation producing outer fruit reflected Indian understanding of consciousness affecting reality. His focus on patience and proper timing echoed Persian teachings about cosmic cycles. Perhaps most significantly, Jesus' confrontation with religious authorities follows a pattern we see across wisdom traditions. In Egypt, reformer pharaohs challenged corrupt priesthoods. In India, Buddha challenged the Brahmanical system. In Persia, Zoroaster opposed established religious practices. In Israel, prophets consistently confronted institutional corruption. This pattern suggests that authentic spiritual insight naturally leads to challenging systems that prioritize power and control over genuine spiritual development. Jesus wasn't unique in facing this opposition. He was part of a universal tradition of enlightened teachers who refused to compromise truth for institutional acceptance. His teaching methods also reflect cross-cultural wisdom approaches. Speaking in parables that revealed truth gradually mirrors the graduated instruction found in mystery schools from Egypt to India. Working with small groups of initiated disciples parallels the guru-student relationships of Eastern traditions. Using symbolic actions that communicated on multiple levels reflects the ritual wisdom of various ancient practices. Most importantly, Jesus' emphasis on direct spiritual experience over belief systems reflects the mystical core found in all authentic spiritual traditions. He consistently pointed people toward their own relationship with the divine rather than dependence on external authorities, whether Roman political power or Jewish religious hierarchy. The implications of this synthesis are profound. If Jesus was weaving together universal wisdom rather than delivering completely unique revelation, it suggests that spiritual truth transcends religious boundaries. The path to enlightenment, to divine connection, to ethical living isn't the exclusive property of any single tradition. This understanding makes sense of his statement that he came not to destroy but to fulfill existing spiritual understanding. He wasn't replacing previous wisdom, he was completing it, showing how all authentic spiritual insights point toward the same fundamental truths about human potential and divine love. Consider how this changes our understanding of his mission. Instead of seeing Jesus as the founder of an exclusive religious system, we can recognize him as someone who discovered the common thread running through all genuine spiritual traditions and found a way to communicate that universal wisdom in language his culture could understand. This synthesis also explains why his teachings have resonated across such diverse cultures throughout history. He wasn't speaking from within the narrow confines of first-century Judaism, he was speaking from the accumulated wisdom of humanity's greatest spiritual insights, adapted for his time and place, but containing truths that transcend any single cultural expression. The question this raises for us today is profound. If the wisdom Jesus taught represents a synthesis of universal spiritual insights, what does that mean for how we approach both Christianity and other spiritual traditions? Perhaps the real message isn't about religious exclusivity, but about recognizing the common spiritual heritage that belongs to all humanity. The deeper you examine Jesus' teachings, the more you realize something extraordinary. Nearly everything he said operates on multiple levels simultaneously. This wasn't accidental rambling or poetic flourish. It was the precise methodology of someone trained in the mystery school tradition we explored earlier. Think about how consistently Jesus taught through parables and symbols. When his disciples asked why he spoke this way, his answer was revealing, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." This is classic esoteric teaching, preserving sacred knowledge while protecting it from those who might corrupt or weaponize it. The Gnostic Christians, those early followers we discussed, who were systematically eliminated by Orthodox Christianity, understood this multi-layered approach intimately. They recognized that Jesus wasn't just telling nice stories, he was encoding transformational technology into seemingly simple statements. Take his most famous declaration, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." Most people hear this as a gentle reminder to be spiritual or kind-hearted. But the Gnostics understood this as a literal instruction manual. Jesus was pointing to the actual location of divine consciousness, not in some distant realm after death, but accessible right now within human awareness itself. This aligns perfectly with what he would have learned during those missing years. The Hindu concept of Atman, the Buddhist understanding of Buddha nature, the Essen teachings about the divine spark all point to the same revolutionary truth. You already contain everything you're seeking. His miracles function the same way. Yes, the Gnostics believed these events actually occurred, but they also recognized them as teaching stories about consciousness transformation. When Jesus turns water into wine, he's demonstrating the alchemical process of transmuting ordinary awareness into divine consciousness. The water represents your current state of mind, clear but flavorless, functional but unremarkable. The wine represents what that same consciousness becomes when touched by divine understanding, rich, intoxicating, celebratory. When he heals the blind, he's not just restoring physical sight, he's showing what happens when spiritual vision opens. The blind man represents anyone living in the darkness of material identification, unable to perceive the deeper reality that surrounds them constantly. The healing demonstrates the awakening of what the Esseners called the eye of the heart, direct perception of spiritual truth. Most powerfully, when Jesus raises the dead, he's illustrating the awakening process itself. The Gnostics understood that most humans live in a state of spiritual death, unconscious, reactive, identified completely with their temporary roles and possessions. Resurrection isn't something that happens after physical death. It's the awakening from this spiritual unconsciousness while still alive. This understanding completely reframes his confrontations with the Pharisees. The Gnostics saw this as something far more significant than religious disagreements. They called it the battle against the archons, the false authorities who maintain humanity in spiritual ignorance through religious and political control systems. Watch how Jesus consistently challenges not just the Pharisees' specific rules, but their entire approach to spirituality. They emphasized external compliance, ritual purity, and hierarchical authority. Jesus taught inner transformation, direct experience, and the inherent divinity of every person. This wasn't a minor theological dispute. It was a fundamental challenge to systems of control that depend on keeping people spiritually disempowered. His instruction to be in the world but not of it provides the practical framework for navigating this challenge. You engage fully with material reality work, relationships, responsibilities, but you don't derive your identity or sense of worth from these temporary circumstances. You recognize them as the playing field for consciousness development, not the source of lasting fulfillment. This connects directly to his emphasis on gnosis over pistis, direct spiritual knowledge over mere belief. Notice how consistently Jesus directed people toward their own experience rather than acceptance of his authority. Go and see for yourself. Ask and you will receive. Seek and you will find. He's not asking for blind faith. He's providing instructions for personal verification. The parable of the Zoa illustrates this perfectly. The seeds represent spiritual teachings, but they land on different types of soil, different levels of consciousness and readiness. Some people hear these ideas, but they're immediately stolen away by doubt or distraction. Others receive them enthusiastically, but have no depth, so the understanding withers when challenged. Still others let the insights get choked out by material concerns and social pressures. But some people provide the right conditions: openness, persistence, and genuine inquiry, and the teachings bear fruit in transformed consciousness. When Jesus told the rich young ruler to sell everything and follow me, the Gnostics understood this wasn't about literal poverty. It was about releasing attachment to external identity and security. The young man's wealth wasn't the problem. His identification with that wealth was what prevented him from accessing the inner kingdom Jesus was describing. This brings us to perhaps the most radical Gnostic insight. crucifixion and resurrection as universal human processes, not unique historical events. The crucifixion represents the ego's death, the painful but necessary dissolution of false identity based on roles, possessions, and social approval. The resurrection represents what emerges from that death consciousness identified with its divine natura rather than its temporary circumstances. The early Gnostic Christians saw Jesus as the master teacher who had completed this process and was showing others the way, not a unique divine being whose sacrifice provided salvation, but a fully awakened human, demonstrating the potential that exists within everyone. This understanding transforms Christianity from a religion about Jesus into a practice based on his actual instructions. The path he outlined, inner purification, direct spiritual experience, service to others, and gradual release from material identification, becomes not a set of beliefs to accept, but a technology for consciousness transformation that remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. The question isn't whether you believe these interpretations, it's whether you're willing to test them through your own direct experience, exactly as Jesus consistently instructed his followers to do. Here's the thing that no one talks about in spiritual circles. We're all walking around with our own lost years. You know what I mean? Those periods where you felt completely stuck, where nothing seemed to be happening, where you questioned everything you thought you knew about yourself and your purpose. Maybe you're in one right now. What if I told you these aren't wasted years at all? What if these periods of apparent stagnation are actually the most crucial phases of your spiritual development? Jesus didn't disappear for 2 decades by accident. He understood something about the rhythm of authentic spiritual growth that our instant gratification culture has completely forgotten. Think about your own life for a moment. Can you identify those times when you withdrew from your normal routine? When you felt this inexplicable pull to question everything, your beliefs, your relationships, your career path? When you started reading books you'd never touched before, exploring ideas that your family or friends might have found strange? That wasn't you having a quarter-life or midlife crisis. That was your soul calling you into your own initiation process. The pattern is remarkably consistent across genuine Ezekiels throughout history. First comes the awakening, that moment when the conventional answers stop satisfying you. You start asking deeper questions. Why am I here? What's the point of all this? Is there more to reality than what I've been taught? This initial awakening often feels uncomfortable because it disrupts the comfortable certainty you once had. Then comes the seeking phase. This is where you dive into different traditions, philosophies, and practices. You might explore meditation, study ancient texts, experiment with different forms of prayer or contemplation. Some people travel during this phase, not as tourists, but as genuine Ezekiels looking for teachers and wisdom. Others do their traveling through books, online courses, or local communities. The key is this voracious appetite for understanding that goes beyond your original cultural or religious programming. But here's where it gets difficult, what mystics call the dark night of the soul. This is when your old belief systems start dissolving, but the new understanding hasn't fully crystallized yet. You're in between worlds. Everything you once were certain about feels shaky, but you haven't yet found your new foundation. This phase can last months or even years. Many people get scared here and retreat back to their old certainties, but those who persist discover something remarkable. The integration phase is where the real magic happens. All those disparate pieces of wisdom you've been collecting start forming a coherent whole. You begin to see the underlying unity beneath apparently contradictory teachings. The Sufi poetry starts making sense alongside the Buddhist meditation instructions and the Christian mystic texts. You realize they're all pointing toward the same fundamental truths about consciousness, love, and the nature of reality. Finally comes emergence, but it's different from how you started. You're not trying to convince anyone of anything. You're not evangelical about your discoveries. Instead, there's this quiet authority that comes from having done the inner work. People start coming to you with their questions, not because you're advertising yourself as a teacher, but because something in your presence suggests you've found some answers. This is exactly what we see in Jesus' story. He emerges from his hidden years not as someone trying to prove himself, but as someone who has clearly done the deep work of inner development. His authority doesn't come from credentials or institutional backing. It comes from the unmistakable quality of someone who has walked the path and integrated the lessons. So how do you navigate your own initiation process? Start with a daily practice that creates space for inner listening. This doesn't have to be formal meditation, though that certainly works. It could be contemplative walking, journaling, or simply sitting quietly for 20 minutes each morning before the world makes its demands on you. The key is consistency and genuine attention to your inner landscape. Study wisdom traditions from multiple cultures, but don't try to become an expert in everything. Instead, look for the common threads. Notice how the Tao Te Ching echoes themes you find in the Gospel of Thomas. See how Rumi's ecstatic poetry points toward the same experiences described in the Hindu Upanishads. This cross-pollination of wisdom traditions was clearly part of Jesus' own development, and it can enrich yours as well. Spend regular time in nature, not for exercise or recreation, but for reflection and inner attunement. There's something about the natural world that helps calibrate our inner compass. Many of the great spiritual breakthroughs happen not in temples or churches, but in mountains, forests, or beside bodies of water. Practice service, but not as a duty or obligation. Find ways to help others that genuinely engage your heart. This could be volunteering, but it could also be bringing more presence and kindness to your existing relationships and responsibilities. Service becomes a form of spiritual practice when it's done with full attention and genuine care. Learn to discern truth from illusion in all areas of your life. This is perhaps the most practical skill you can develop. Start questioning not just religious or spiritual claims, but the assumptions underlying your career choices, your relationships, your consumption patterns. What are you doing because you genuinely choose it? And what are you doing because you think you're supposed to? Here's what I've learned about recognizing when you're in a preparation phase versus when you're ready to share what you've discovered. During preparation, you're primarily concerned with your own understanding and growth. You're hungry for new insights, new practices, new perspectives. But when you're ready to emerge, the focus naturally shifts. You find yourself more concerned with how to serve others' growth than with accumulating more knowledge for yourself. The biggest obstacle most people face is impatience with their own process. We live in a culture that demands immediate results, visible progress, measurable outcomes, but authentic spiritual development doesn't follow quarterly business reports. It follows natural rhythms that can't be rushed or forced. Your struggles, your confusion, your periods of doubt, these aren't signs that you're failing. They're the raw materials of wisdom. End of 2014. Every challenge you work through becomes a resource for helping others who face similar difficulties. This is why people who have done their own inner work can offer such genuine compassion and practical guidance. They're not speaking from theory, they're speaking from lived experience. The most important thing to remember is this: your lost years aren't lost at all. They're the hidden foundation upon which your real contribution to the world will be built. Trust the process, even when you can't see where it's leading. Jesus' example shows us that the most powerful teaching comes not from those who have avoided the difficult questions, but from those who have wrestled with them in the depths of their own souls and emerged with hard-won wisdom to share. The most profound truth about Jesus' lost years isn't what happened during them, it's why they remain hidden. This silence speaks louder than any gospel, revealing a fundamental principle that transforms how we understand both spiritual development and historical truth itself. Throughout history, every transformative figure has disappeared before their emergence. Buddha spent 6 years in solitary, seeking before his enlightenment. Moses fled to the wilderness for decades before returning to lead his people. Muhammad retreated to caves for years of contemplation before receiving his revelations. Even in our modern world, the pattern persists. Steve Jobs took a transformative journey to India before revolutionizing technology. The Beatles disappeared to study with the Maharishi before creating their most innovative music. This isn't coincidence, it's necessity. The most authentic spiritual development happens in silence, away from the expectations and projections of others. Jesus' missing years demonstrate that genuine wisdom emerges not from public performance but from private transformation. The carpenter's son who left Nazareth wasn't ready to teach. The master who returned had been forged in the crucible of direct experience. What Jesus likely discovered during those hidden decades reveals something revolutionary about the nature of spiritual truth. If our exploration of his probable journey through Egypt, India, and the mystery schools is accurate, then his later teachings represent not divine revelation handed down from above, but universal wisdom discovered through direct experience and cross-cultural learning. This changes everything. It means spiritual truth transcends religious boundaries. The love Jesus taught wasn't exclusively Christian, it was the same compassion Buddha discovered, the same unity the Vedantic sages realized, the same divine connection the Egyptian initiates experienced. His parables about the kingdom of heaven echo the Buddhist concept of Buddha nature, the Hindu understanding of Atman Brahman, and the Gnostic recognition of the divine spark within. More importantly, Jesus' hidden preparation reveals that authentic spiritual authority comes not from institutional appointment but from inner development. He didn't emerge from a seminary or receive ordination from established priests. His authority came from direct experience of the truths he taught. When he spoke of dying to the old self and being reborn, he knew this transformation intimately. When he taught about overcoming fear and attachment, he had walked that path himself. This understanding challenges both religious fundamentalism and secular materialism in profound ways. Fundamentalism claims exclusive access to divine truth through particular doctrines or institutions. But if Jesus himself drew from multiple wisdom traditions, then no single religion can claim monopoly on spiritual understanding. The truth he embodied was too vast for any one container. Equally, secular materialism dismisses spiritual experience as delusion or wishful thinking. But Jesus' example suggests that spiritual development follows observable patterns and produces measurable results: greater compassion, wisdom, inner peace, and the ability to serve others effectively. These aren't supernatural miracles but natural outcomes of dedicated inner work. What emerges is a vision of spiritual development that's both universal and practical. Jesus' synthesis of multiple wisdom traditions points toward the future of human consciousness, moving beyond sectarian divisions toward recognition of the common ground underlying all authentic spiritual paths. Whether expressed through Christian love, Buddhist compassion, Hindu devotion, or Sufi surrender, the same fundamental transformation is occurring: the dissolution of the separate self and the awakening to our deeper nature. For modern seekers, Jesus' hidden years offer a practical template. First, the importance of studying multiple traditions rather than limiting ourselves to single perspectives. Truth is too vast for any one approach to contain completely. Second, the primacy of personal practice over intellectual understanding. Jesus didn't just study these teachings, he lived them, embodied them, allowed them to transform him completely. Third, his example reveals the necessity of inner preparation before attempting to teach or guide others. The years of silence weren't wasted time, but essential development. In our age of instant expertise and social media authority, Jesus' patient preparation offers a different model, one that prioritizes depth over visibility, transformation over information. Perhaps most importantly, understanding Jesus' lost years transforms how we relate to our own periods of uncertainty and apparent stagnation. Those times when we feel lost, when nothing seems to be happening, when we're between identities or life phases, these aren't empty spaces but sacred incubation periods. Like Jesus in the wilderness or studying in distant temples, we're being prepared for something we can't yet see. This perspective becomes crucial when we consider humanity's current situation. We're living through what might be called collective lost years, a time of apparent chaos, institutional breakdown, and spiritual confusion. Traditional religious forms are losing relevance for many, while purely materialistic worldviews leave people hungry for meaning. Political systems seem increasingly inadequate, economic structures serve fewer people, and environmental crises demand fundamental changes in how we live. But what if this apparent chaos is actually preparation? What if humanity as a whole is in a transformative transition, much like Jesus during his hidden years? The breakdown of old forms might be creating space for new synthesis, new understanding, new ways of being that integrate ancient wisdom with contemporary knowledge. Jesus' example provides navigation tools for this transition, maintaining inner peace amid outer turbulence, drawing wisdom from multiple sources while staying grounded in direct experience, preparing to serve from genuine understanding rather than mere belief or ideology, recognizing that the most profound changes often happen slowly, invisibly, in the depths of consciousness before manifesting in the world. The silence of Jesus' lost years isn't empty, it's pregnant with infinite possibility. Just as those hidden decades contained the seeds of teachings that would transform civilization, the quiet periods in our own lives often hold our greatest potential contributions. The key is learning to trust the process, to value depth over speed, to understand that authentic development requires time, patience, and often sacred obscurity. In the end, Jesus' missing years teach us that the most important journeys happen not in the spotlight, but in the silence, not in the doing, but in the becoming, not in the teaching, but in the learning. The carpenter who disappeared into history's shadows returned as a master precisely because he had learned to find the eternal in the temporary, the universal in the particular, the divine in the human. If this exploration of Jesus' hidden years and their meaning for our own spiritual development resonated with you, let us know by commenting "I understood it."